Just wait. Good morning, all of you. And this is the second class on the Westland. And today we will discuss the Westland as an autobiographical poem and as a social and cultural critique. Now, when the Westland was published, I.A. Richards found it as an articulation of the plight of a whole generation. So I.A. Richards believed, or I.A. Richards observed, that the poem is an articulation of the plight of a whole generation. It is not just an autobiographical or a personal poem. Now, Eliot's response to this observation of I.A. Richards was something that opposes I.A. Richards' beliefs. Now, Eliot discouraged this interpretation of the poem in this way, that this poem is not a criticism of the contemporary world. So, Eliot believed that this poem is not a criticism of the contemporary world, and he writes, when I wrote a poem called The Westland, he says that when I wrote the poem called The Westland in 1931, he says, some of the more approving critics said that I had expressed the disillusionment of a generation. So Eliot says that some of the most famous or approving critics said after I wrote or composed The Westland that this is a poem containing the disillusionment of a generation. So, and then Eliot adds his comment. He says that which is nonsense. He says that this is nonsense. And then he adds, I may have expressed for them their own illusion of being disillusioned. He says that I may have expressed for them their own illusion of being disillusioned. He says that this poem particularly expresses their own illusion of being disillusioned, that they are feeling that they have been disillusioned with this poem, and Eliot says that this is just an illusion, that they have been disillusioned, but that did not form the part of my intention. And then he adds that this was not exactly, though it is just a sort of illusion of being disillusioned, so this was not the part of his intention. Now, what was Eliot's preference for this poem? Eliot preferred to describe the poem as an expression of his state of mind rather than as social criticism. Now, here Eliot says that this poem is just an expression of his state of mind and not a part of his social criticism. Now, you can question me that, sir, in tradition and individual talent, Eliot has expressed his view that art lies in concealing art, and an artist should control his emotions while creating art. He should not express his personal feelings or emotions in his work of art. So that is what Eliot said as his theory of impersonal impersonality, and so many things that he has discussed in his tradition of tradition and individual talent. And then he himself says that the Westland is a poem that expresses his state of mind, and this is not a social criticism. Now, we will discuss this and clarify what actually Eliot has said and how he changed his stances to arrive at a very concrete idea and concrete point about his creation. Now, various critics, Eliot says, have done me the honor to interpret the poem in terms of criticism of the contemporary world. So many critics, Eliot says, have said that this poem is just a criticism of the contemporary world, has considered it indeed as an important bit of social criticism. He says that they have considered this poem as an important work on social criticism. And then he says, to me, it was only the relief of a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life. So he says that this poem was just an expression of my personal feelings and my insignificant grouse against life. But it is just an expression of my personal state of mind, my personal feeling. It is just a piece of rhythmical grumbling. He says that this is just my grumbling at. Now, this at is very important at. He is grumbling at what? Is he only grumbling at his own personal pains and personal problems, or he is grumbling at the social situation outside? He is grumbling at the post World War situation that he sees around. So that is the question. Now, the thing we will see here that Eliot later changes his stance, and we will see that a creative mind is not only sensitive to his personal feelings, to his personal emotions, and to the personal situations of his life, but he is also sensitive to what is going on outside. So when Eliot is actually finalizing the manuscript of Westland, that was a post-World War in Europe, and where a sensitive mind has to be responsive to what is going on outside. Eliot, being a very sensitive person, Eliot, being a very sensitive artist, was compelled to react and respond to what is going on around elsewhere. So we will see that elsewhere, the Eliot actually modified his stance on the interaction between the poetic expression of personal experience and its more general significance as interpreted by the readers. So later he changed his stance about the intention of his poetic expression. What is it? Is it only an expression of personal experience, or it is a social criticism? He changed, and he says that a poet may believe, he says that a poet may believe that he is expressing only his private experience. He says that a poet may believe that the poet's primary intention may be to express his private experiences. Hence, his lines may be for him only a means of talking about himself. He may believe that his lines are only to express his mind, to be articulate his own feelings, talking about himself without giving himself away. Yet for his readers, so he was always open, and we can find the traces of reader response criticism here, that Eliot is not very authoritative in giving or in loading his poem with his own interpretations. Rather, he keeps the poem open. He leaves the poem open for the readers to interpret that according to their own understanding. He says that the reader, yet for his readers, he says, what he has written may come to be the expression both of their own secret feelings. So the poet may express his own feelings in his poem or in his work of art or in his creation, but there are scopes that the readers will find their mind or their feelings expressed in that poem by the poet, or through the poetical excellence of that poet, of their own secret feelings and of the exaltation or despair of a generation. The poet may write something for his own sake. He is just expressing his own mind, but that poem may give space for the readers to accommodate their feelings, to accommodate their scopes of finding their feelings expressed in that poem. And that also may be applicable to the whole, applicable for the whole generation. The whole generation may find their state of mind expressed in that poem. Now, recent criticism has emphasized the confessional and autobiographical aspects of the Westland. Now, the recent criticism actually now emphasizes what Elias has said, that this is just a poem expressing my personal feelings and emotions. The poem's critique of the contemporary post-war scene has been interpreted that they say that the poems, uh, this this poem's intention of expressing the post-war scene, this has been interpreted as a strategy Eliot used for presenting indirectly. This strategy he has used for presenting indirectly his spiritual autobiography. He says that these critics of the recent critics of the Westland say that this poem, though it is set in the post-war Europe, this is also presenting indirectly Eliot's spiritual autobiography in an age that was not conducive to the genre. So he is writing a poem, and such a poem in an age which age was not conducive to the genre like poem. Now Eliot's pressing need, it has been suggested, what was Eliot's need, what was Eliot's intention, was a desire to dig up what he really was and felt. Now they say that Eliot's intention was to dig up what exactly he was and what he was feeling. It has also been argued, it has also been argued that the historical and cultural dimensions of the poem does not lie at its center. So they say that the historical and cultural dimension that we find in the poem, for which we intend to label the poem or brand the poem as a poem having social criticism. So they say that this historical and cultural dimensions of the poem does not lie at its center, but it exists. But this historical and cultural dimensions that the poem has, it exists as an objective correlative. That is what Eliot has said. That's an objective correlative for the underlying feelings. It is an objective correlative for the underlying feelings which are deeply, if obscurely personal. So, and that if underlying feelings which are deeply and if obscurely personal, and that if in the Westland Eliot presents a crisis or breakdown of civilization, this has to be understood as first of all a crisis or breakdown in himself. So they say that the recent critics say that this poem is a very powerful objective correlative that expresses or that expresses the very obscure but personal emotions and feelings. So the historical and cultural dimension which the poem has, and which expresses or which actually projects the decay, the decay, the decaying civilization, the fall of the civilization, the inner hollowness of the civilization, which is just an objective correlative which actually expresses the obscure feelings and emotions, and ultimately it wants to express the crisis or breakdown that was there in the mind of Eliot. Now, this is what the recent criticism is. Now, to read the Westland as an autobiographical poem is not to interpret it reductively. Now, if you try to read the Westland as an autobiographical poem, it will be just to focus on Eliot's private life, his nervous breakdown, his physical weaknesses, as well as his marital problems. But to see it as enacting deeply felt if obscure emotions and psychic conflicts. But what they say, that the recent critics say, that if you want to interpret the Westland as an autobiographical poem and try to focus on Eliot's personal pains and personal emotions, it will be a wrong interpretation. But you have to take it as an objective correlative, which through the crisis that we see around, which actually projects the crisis around the civilization, and which through that projecting of crisis of the civilization, it actually wants to express, it actually wants to project the inner breakdown in the mind that is there in Eliot's personal crisis. So this is what actually the recent criticism wants to say about Eliot's Wasteland. Now here we will see that Eliot actually is conforming to what he said about his impersonal theory of poetry, that actually poetry, in poetry or in any work of art, the poet or the artist is not expressing his personal emotions very directly, but he conceals it, and the poem may work, or the work of art may work as an objective correlative, which actually connects the obscure personal feelings of the poems, which are not directly expressed in the poem, but which are expressed through the crisis that they see around. And here we find that what was personally Eliot's own feeling, or Eliot's personal feelings, have been universalized, and that becomes applicable to all the readers who read this poem, to all who come in contact with his work of art. And here he makes a sort of connection. The poet connects with the world outside. And even is so the poem's criticism of the contemporary world, that we say that it is a criticism of the contemporary world, cannot altogether be discounted at the same time. You cannot reject that it is a social criticism also. However, to do so would be to diminish much of its power and significance. So you have to consider the Eliot's Wasteland both as a poem that expresses his inner breakdown, his personal crisis, his emotional crisis, as well as a poem that expresses social criticism, which contains within it social criticism, and which actually also projects the decay of the civilization, the decaying civilization, the loss of faith and belief in the post World War in Europe. Eliot was actually deeply affected by the political and economic crisis in Europe during and after the First World War. And we see that he is writing to his father, and we will see what he writes. Everyone's individual lives are so swallowed up in the one great tragedy, he says, regarding the World War, that how it has affected us, that every individual's lives are so swallowed up in the one great tragedy, that is the one great tragedy, that one almost ceases to have personal experiences or emotions, that one actually ceases, that there we find no personal or individual emotions, and such as one has seemed so unimportant. And if you have your own personal emotions, they are very unimportant. He then says, I have a lot of things to write about it. So what he wants to focus on is that after this world war, after this first world war, we have no time, and we cannot afford to give too much stress upon our personal emotions and personal feelings and personal crisis. So my personal emotion has to be connected with the personal emotions with of the people who are around us. And this is how Eliot is trying to disconnect the disjointed things that is see around. So he says, I have a lot of things to write about if the time ever comes when people will attain to them. So he says that I will write about it. He is writing this in 1917, and later on he worked on finalizing the drafts of the Wasteland. Now, he says into his father that I have the intention of writing such things if I find that the time and the climate is conducive and the readers will be interested in such writings. Now, after the World War, what happened? Eliot was working in Lloyd's Bank, and he was put in charge of settling the pre-war debts between Lloyd's Bank and the Germans. And when he was doing this, of the settlement of the pre-war debts, he was involved in studying the international financial arrangements between England and Germany. And then he became aware of the financial status of Europe as well as the world under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So there was a Treaty of Versailles, and after the First World War, and after that treaty, there was a decision taken that the settlements of the dates that have been taken by Germany and other countries during the war have to be settled. And Eliot was put in charge of settling these pre-war debts. So he, at that time, he studied the financial papers and other things, and he became aware of the financial condition of Europe and the world as well. Consequently, he must have gained considerable understanding of the economic disaster in which Europe had been plunged as a result of the war. So he became aware of the economic disaster that Europe faced after the First World War. In a letter written in 1921, 7th April 1921, to Richard Aldington, he writes to Richard Aldington, Eliot describes the feelings of loathing and repugnance which the contemporary situation induced in him. So it is not that the First World War did not affect Eliot, but Eliot was highly affected by the effects and consequences of the First World War. And he wrote that in a letter to Richard Aldington, that his feeling of loathing and repugnance which the contemporary situation has induced in him. So it is very much possible that this feeling of repugnance and loathing will be expressed in his poem The Wasteland that he writes after the First World War. So Wasteland is not just an autobiographical poem which expresses his personal feelings and emotions, but at the same time it is also a very important document of the social criticism. The West End reflects Eliot's acute concern with the disintegration of the European civilization. So the Westland, in the lines of Westland, we will see that even in the lines that London Bridge is falling down, the unreal city, he actually was very much concerned with the disintegration of the European civilization. The poem has consequently been interpreted as an imperial epic. So it was interpreted, the poem Westland, as an imperial epic and as an image of imperial catastrophe. So it was uh, projected as an imperial epic and as an epic that projects imperial catastrophe. Now, in a review of 1919, the Eliot distance in a review, Eliot writes that he distances himself from imperialism and he draws a connection between romanticism and imperialism. Now here we will see that how Eliot is trying to connect romanticism and imperialism. He, at the same time, he is criticizing imperialism and he is very much disturbed with the self-evasion, individualism and restraint and the lack of restraint that we find in romanticism. And there we will find that Eliot is trying to connect romanticism and imperialism, and we will see here how he does this. George Wyndham's essays in romantic literature, Eliot writes that George Wyndham in his essays in romantic literature, he writes, could be that particular essay, according to Eliot, could be discussed only as the expression of this peculiar English type. So he says that Wyndham's essay is through Wyndham's essay, Eliot wants to show the connection between imperialism and romanticism. And for that he shows and he wants to show that the Wyndham's essays in romantic literature, it is an expression, according to Eliot, expression of this peculiar English type. And then he says the aristocrat, the imperialists, and the romantics. He puts them in a single line, side by side. The aristocrats, the imperialists, the romantic, looking with wonder upon the world as upon a fairyland. Now, all of them, the aristocrats, the romantics, and the imperialists, they look at the world as a fairy tale, but it is not like that. They always try to project an utopic picture of this world, which Eliot wants to criticize. He went on to suggest tentatively the political ramifications of the relationships between romanticism and imperialism, that this connection has political ramifications also. And he says, he comments, it would be of interest to divagate from literature to politics. He says, but that it would be of interest to divagate from literature to politics and inquire to what extent romanticism is incorporate in imperialism. He says that he wants to show that how that where and how and to what extent romanticism is incorporate in imperialism. And then he says the very important line, to what extent romanticism has possessed the imaginations of imperialists. So imperialists have made the use of romanticism for their certain agenda. Okay, and to what extent it was made use of by Disraeli also. Now, how politics, that he wants to show that there are political ramifications in the connection between romanticism and imperialism, and this shows that how Disraeli that has made use of this connection between romanticism and imperialism to work with his own agenda. Given Eliot's distrust of romanticism, now if we take it as an accepted thing that Eliot has distrust for romanticism, for what? Because of its self-evasion, individualism, and lack of restraint, it would be easy to infer that he extends his criticism to imperialism as well. Now, Eliot is critical, or Eliot wants to criticize both imperialism, romanticism, and with that, he wants to criticize the political ramifications that actually make use of this connection between romanticism and imperialism. The naive romantic attitudes, such as those of Wyndham, according to Eliot, were exploited. Now, this naivety that romanticism has, this has been exploited by imperialist politicians such as Disraeli. That was Eliot's point. Now, in a later essay, Eliot asserted a continuity between the Roman Empire and the contemporary civilization of Europe. Now, after showing the connection between imperialism and romanticism and the political ramifications and its effect on this connection, he wants to show the continuity between Roman Empire and the contemporary civilization of Europe. He says that we are all, so far as we inherit the civilization of Europe. So he says that we are all, so far as we inherit the civilization of Europe, we who are a part of this European civilization, we are all, he says, still citizens of the Roman Empire. He says that we are citizens of the Roman Empire. However, Eliot went on to emphasize the disparity between the ideal of the Roman Empire. So what he wants to emphasize? They emphasize the disparity, the disparity between what? Between the ideal of the Roman Empire, which Virgil has imagined, and the political reality that we find in the Roman Empire of the legionaries, the proconsuls, the governors, the businessmen, the speculators, the demagogues, and generals. He says that there is a disparity between what? The Roman Empire that we see in the work of Virgil, and the Roman Empire with its political realities consisting of the legionaries, the proconsuls, the governors, the businessmen, the speculators, and so on. Now, Virgil's concept, according to Eliot, remains an ideal. So Virgil's concept of Roman Empire was an ideal Roman Empire, the highest for any merely temporal empire. So it was an ideal empire. And later it was left to Christianity to develop and to cherish this ideal, and it became the Holy Roman Empire. So Virgil's Roman Empire, which according to Eliot was the ideal Roman Empire, was later given to the Christianity to develop and to cherish this ideal, and it became the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Eliot opposes the concept of empire as a political entity. He opposes the concept of empire as a political entity, and he wants to take it as a spiritual empire of Christianity. He doesn't want to accept the concept of empire, that the concept of Roman Empire as a political entity, but he wants to accept it as a spiritual empire of Christianity. Although it is highly questionable that can we divide the political entity of the Roman Empire and the spiritual empire? Is it possible? Now, the apocalyptic vision of the falling towers of imperial cities that we find in the Westland, you will find in Westland line 368 to 376, you will find the falling of the towers appears to express Eliot's criticism of merely temporal empires. He is telling that London Bridge is falling down, and later he says the city unreal. They are the unreal city unreal. They are unreal, just as London is the unreal city because of this spiritual decay. Now he actually wanted to oppose the political entity of the empire. He wants to give stress on the spiritual empire. For that, he shows in his poem that how the city actually declines, or how the city actually is devastated. The bridge actually is broken. London Bridge is falling down. And he considers this city of London as a city unreal, to show that there is spiritual decay and his disbelief and his disrespect for the temporal empire with its political and as a political entity. Now, Westland has been read as an elitist and defeatist poem. Some people believe that it is a elitist and defeatist poem trapped in the prison of culture, inviting precisely the kind of responses derided by Eliot. Then what is that? What did Eliot deride in that in his response? The illusion of being disillusioned. So this is what Eliot wanted to say about some critics who wanted to consider Westland as a poem having social criticism. Okay, so illusion of being disillusioned and encouraging a superior self-flattering cynicism. It is not like that. It has also been severely criticized. It has also been severely criticized for its reactionary politics, as evident, for instance, in Eliot's laconic gloss in his notes to the present decay of Eastern Europe as one of the themes of part 5, and in the allusion to the hooded hordes, refugees from communist Russia, as Eliot's reference to his notes to Hermann Hesse in Blix ins Chaos suggests. Now, various people they have criticized Westland for various reasons. Some people say that it is an elitist and defeatist poem. Some people say that the poem is trapped in its prison of culture, and some people say that it is an illusion of being disillusioned, which Eliot derided about the criticism that some of the most approving critics made about the poem. It has also been criticized for its reactionary politics, which is evident in the laconic gloss of Eliot and in its notes to the present decay of Eastern Europe and many other things, that Eliot was something that this poem actually contains, and it was criticized for so many reasons. Stephen Spender recalls in 1936, there's a very good book on Westland by Stephen Spender. In 1936, Stephen Spender says that a significant rejection to the Westland, so he points out a significant cause to reject Westland. He says that a significant rejection to Westland was that of a 16-year-old schoolboy, John Cornford, who, as a result of reading this poem, joined the British Communist Party. Now, this particular boy, John Cornford, who read the poem and he joined the British Communist Party. Why? Because he took this poem to be about this poem to be about the collapse of capitalist society. So we find that various readers have interpreted this Westland or this poem of Eliot in their own ways. Okay, so he took it that John Cornford took this poem as a poem against a capitalist society. Now, D.W. Harding remembers the poem as a formidable piece of anti-establishment writing. Now, D.W. Harding, he took this poem as a piece of anti-establishment writing with its challenging newness. Why it is an anti-establishment poem? Because it has a challenging newness of technique, the range of its social references, the intensity, but at the same time, the astringency and the control of its emotional response to contemporary existence. Now, Harding took this poem as an anti-establishment writing because of its challenging newness of technique. The technique is new. The range of its social references, it has a wide range of social references and the intensity, but at the same time he says that along with this it has the astringency and control of its emotional response. Maybe the poem contains the emotional condition of the poet. The poem may express or project the inner breakdown and crisis of the poem, but the treatment of those emotions are very much controlled. There's a control in emotional response, and it has also references to the contemporary existence. Now, finally, we can say that the Westland resists, this is the final take that we can have, that it resists unitary interpretations. You cannot have a very authoritative and singular unitary interpretation of Westland. The power of the poem lies in its openness to divergent readings, and in the challenge it gives you the scope of divergent readings. It is very much open. It is an open text and challenges, and in the challenges that it poses to the presuppositions of the readers. So it actually resists any kind of presuppositions that the reader can have. So Westland is a very open poem, and it is something which invites various criticisms and interpretations. Okay.